Welcome to the Gospel Addict Podcast. I'm Greg Bryan.
And I'm Jim Reske.
We're gospel addicts because we believe the gospel of Jesus isn't just good news, it's the best news ever.
We're addicted to the gospel because it doesn't just start us out in the Christian life, it is the Christian life.
Join us as we look at the Bible through the lens of the gospel.
Thanks so much for listening.
Hey, you're listening to the Gospel Addict Podcast. I'm Greg Bryan. I'm joined with my co-host, Jim Reske, and it's just Jim and I tonight. Just want to give you some, exciting updates of things that have happened with us. I just recently returned from leading a group of people to the Holy Land. So I'm going to talk, Jim's going to interview me a little bit about that. And then, Jim, I wanted to start out with getting an update from you on the book that you're working on.
No, thanks, Greg. First of all, great to be with you. Thanks everyone who's out there listening in. So the book's been quite a journey. Been working on it for a while now, a couple years, and put together a manuscript last year. And I think I may have told our listeners that I got a manuscript together and started working with an editor who has published 5 Christian books himself, and who really worked with me and went through things, the draft with a fine-tooth comb, and not just like editing to make suggestions, but really reorganizing everything, reorganizing the thought flow, understanding who the target audience is, the kind of discipline you have when you're really writing a book, not just writing out a stream of consciousness. Because when I started it out, Greg, I'm so excited about the content, which is the gospel, which is what makes you and I gospel addicts, that I just had so much to write, and it's just getting it out was important. And then giving it to somebody who say, yeah, that's great, but let's really organize it like a book and put it together.
Well, and because we might have people just listening for the very first time, can you talk about just the topic of the book?
Yeah, the basic topic of the book is the gospel gap. It's an illustration you and I talk about all the time, and it's a contrast of 2 different ways to live your Christian life. And you might think of it as outside-in transformation versus inside-out transformation. But the basic notion is that if you want to draw a picture of the Christian life, you could do it by just drawing a simple graph of holiness on the y-axis, with a vertical axis, and then time on the horizontal axis. And if you want to say, well, what does a Christian life look like? You would draw a diagonal line that starts at the bottom left and moves up to the top right. And if you stop there, of course, that looks like every other religion, because every religion is based on a set of rules you have to follow, which means over time you become a better and better Jew, or better and better Hindu, better Muslim or Buddhist, anything as a set of tenets, rules, principles, and that they will call holiness or righteousness or goodness or anything. And over time, you moved from the bottom left to the upper right. You become better and better in that religion. And this view applied to Christianity is that the gospel starts you off. It's a little cross in the bottom left corner of that illustration. Starts you off, gives you a clean slate, and then the rest is up to you. And spiritually, that would mean your justification is by faith and by grace, but your sanctification, your Christian walk, how you grow in Christ, your Christian life, your Christian experience is all driven by you and your hard work and effort. And I think, Greg, we talk about the ABCs. How do you put that when we talk about that?
Well, for some people, the gospel is the ABCs of the Christian life, and then you move on to deeper, doctrine. But really, what you and I believe with all our hearts is that the gospel is not the ABCs, it's the A to Z of the Christian life. It is the Christian life. You never move beyond it. It's just as important for Christians as for non-Christians. And that changed my life, because as a young Christian, I kind of fell into the trap of what you just shared, of thinking that, Christ got me, my salvation was through the gospel, through what Christ did for me on the cross, paying for my sins. But when it comes to being a better Christian, it was all up to me and my hard work and effort. But that leads you to a lot of pride if you're successful.
If it's successful.
Yeah, if you're successful, or sort of despair if you're not successful. And I can remember kind of feeling both those as a struggling Christian. And I realized I kind of moved beyond the gospel.
Yeah.
And I needed to kind of return to the gospel. And that really, through God's grace and teachings I was exposed to from, both of us really appreciate the ministry of Dr. Timothy Keller.
That's right.
That really kind of brought me back to, wait a minute, grace is what saves me. The gospel is what saves me, but it's also the key to our spiritual growth and development. So you described the one way. So quickly describe the new illustration.
Yeah, and I think since you're kind of very similar to your personal experience, Greg, and this is before you and I met. I mean, my personal experience to my early 30s was just like yours, and really getting burned down on it, feeling, and I write about this in the book, but just feeling like this is just so hard. It's so hard when you think about your Christianity on a scale of 1 to 10, and you feel like you could never get above a 5 or maybe a 6 on a good day. Maybe I reach to a 7, then I'm back to a 3 or 2. And you talk about, if you do get up that ladder, you feel a little bit of pride. And in fact, if you're a spiritual leader and you have that view of the Christian life, you would say, well, absolutely, I want to use pride and fear as motivational tools, because the whole point is to move you up and to the right. And so, but you really burn out on it. And we got to the point where we were almost ready to walk away from the whole thing, feeling like it's just too hard. And that's when we lived in New York City. We attended Tim Keller's church and really started to hear the gospel in a totally different way. And it's really depicted in this thing I want to write about, which is this illustration to show how the gospel is operative for your whole Christian life. It's the A to Z. You never, like you said a minute ago, you never leave the gospel. That's why we're gospel addicts. That's why I feel like, I felt like when it happened, when I really started to get a glimpse of that gospel, I was born again already, but then I was born again, and felt like I just can't stop talking about Jesus. That's why that's really actually why we love doing this podcast together, just because I love talking about Jesus.
And that's why the whole podcast is called Gospel Addicts, because we're addicted to the gospel, to the good news of Jesus, because we think it's the best news ever.
Best news ever. And I think people, we're always stunned, right? When people don't take the offer. Why would you not take this offer? And I think part of it is because people look at Christianity like that single line. They say, wait, you're offering me the chance to move up to apply myself with a lifetime of toil and hard work and effort to maybe please a God who's never satisfied. No thanks. Or they're already living the Christian life. They're saying, I've kind of had it. Like I'm always feeling bad and guilty. I never measure up. No thanks. And when you get a glimpse of the real gospel, you say, taste and see that the Lord is good. Why wouldn't you take it? So, anyway, the contrast is looking at that. I'm sorry, what, you're going to say something?
Well, I was just going to say, isn't a big part of the book that you're writing contrasting religion from the gospel from religion, the difference between religion versus the gospel?
Yeah, and I think that we spent a lot of time actually on the illustration we just talked about, because that is a religious way of thinking of your Christian life. That, I obey, therefore I'm accepted, and I climb the ladder. Maybe at the end of my Christian life, I'll bet you a lot of our listeners will resonate with this. If you, at the end of your life, maybe you'll hear, "Well done, thou good and faithful servant." Aren't those words you want to hear? Won't your heart swell up with pride? Is everyone else behind you in line, their spirits are crushed because they're not going to hear, but you've done better. You're a 9 out of 10. Welcome in. We rarely get people like you around here. Well done, thou good and faithful servant. Isn't that great? That's supposed to be motivational, but it's crushing, right? And that whole way of thinking about even that verse is driven because you're reading the Bible through that single line paradigm, which isn't right. It isn't the gospel. So, but anyway, we try to kind of treat all that in the book and then kind of shift to what, sometimes call a double line paradigm, or basically the gospel gap for short, which I think is a shorthand way of thinking about it.
So going back to that verse, the "well done, thou good and faithful servant," what do you think the gospel, looking at that through the lens of the gospel, what does that look like?
Well, because we talked about this before, Greg, but the servant in that verse isn't you. We read the Bible, read ourselves into it, and say, it's all about me. It's all about what I've got to do. And when God is going to look at me at the judgment, He is going to look at me through the lens of everything Jesus has done and all my evil, rotten to the core, sinful self has been put on him and wiped away, and all his glorious righteousness has been put on me in the great exchange, right? That's the verse Isaiah 1. Though your sins are as scarlet, they'll be white as snow. That's the great exchange. And in that, he's going to say, well done, thou good and faithful servant, but it's capital S servant because it's Jesus's record and not mine.
That's also 2 Corinthians 5:21.
Exactly.
God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God.
Yeah.
I don't know if I quoted that exactly right, but I think I got the gist of it.
You did.
There's just so many verses when you really understand the shift. It's a massive shift.
Massive shift.
In thinking of your sanctification. This isn't your salvation. This is your sanctification.
That's right.
It's a massive shift. And when you start reading the Bible through this lens, the Bible just comes alive. I mean, there's verses like in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 18, which says, for the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us as believers who are being saved, it's the power of God.
That's right.
I mean, right. And then Peter writes, grow in the grace and knowledge of our Lord and Savior Jesus. Grow in grace. That's right. That's exactly what you're talking about. What does it mean to grow in grace? It's inside out. It's not outside in. So often religion is outside in. It's like, we do all this stuff. But the gospel is done. It's done. It's been done for us through Christ, through the cross. So as you've been working on your book, and I know you've been working on it for quite some time, you're reorganizing. Is there anything you want to share, like related to like some cool ways that you've reorganized it or
yeah. Well, so actually right now you just mentioned this, the word shift. I'm just polishing off a couple chapters towards the middle of the book that really talk about this gospel shift, this paradigm shift, and the notion that it is a paradigm shift. You see the world through that lens, the single line lens, like every religion. And if you read the Bible through that lens, a lot of things just don't make sense. A lot of things don't make sense. You say these Old Testament characters are supposed to be examples for us. They're supposed to be 9s and 8s and 9s on the 1 to 10 scale. They're awful. They do all kinds of miserably bad things. I don't understand. It doesn't make any sense. And it's because you're using the wrong paradigm, because you're using that single line paradigm to read it. And then the Bible is filled with stories of people who make the shift from the single line to the double line. So from a religious paradigm to a gospel paradigm, and contrast, sometimes in the same chapter, with people who don't make the shift or refuse to make the shift or can't make the shift. Right. And anyway, I go into great detail about that. But this contrast of and that's why Jesus says so many times, he uses metaphors of opening your eyes and healing a blind person that they may see. And these people are blind in their sins, but they want to open their eyes. The opening your eyes in the gospel, and there are our listeners who are Christians will get this right away, right? Suddenly, when you get the gospel, everything looks different. It's a paradigm shift. The lens through which you look at the world shifts completely, and you see everything differently, including all those old passages you read before that seem to be motivational stories for you to be just like them and work hard to climb up the ladder and turn your 6 into a 7 and keep going. And now you say, these people were recipients of free grace just like me. They're lost to their sins just like me, and God gave them to his righteousness. So anyway, that's what I've been working on recently, and it's coming together. My hope is this year we can really get it out there and get in front of some publishers, and we'll see what happens.
Have you been adding new content?
Some of the content I have, some of it's reorganization of stuff I've already written. The new content is trying to put it to understand in terms of Christian leaders and how they can use it, and then also in evangelism, how it can be used in evangelism. Because a lot of the evangelical tools we use in the past are really kind of simple and fall short, really, and I don't think they always work with a modern audience. So trying to relate it and have it touch down where it can be used as a tool for evangelism. That's some of the new content.
Okay, how close do you feel like you are to finishing the project?
I got a day job,
right?
So keep my job, and pretty demanding job as it is, and It's not like it takes that much time. It's the long gaps in between picking it up and working on it. So, and I think the last 2 weeks I've been on a tear, and it's amazing when God puts this kind of thing in your heart. It's like you have to get it out, And I started off thinking I'm just going to put all this into a Microsoft Word document that my kids could read someday, and it's like it's just such a burden just to get it out and get it out somewhere. And maybe it'll just be self-published on Amazon. That'll be enough. We'll see, but we'll see. Hopefully someone could benefit from it.
Well, I think, you and I agree. It's such an important thing. And so many Christians have the default setting of the human heart is towards hard work and performance.
That's right. Religiosity.
And that default setting is so, once we become a follower of Jesus, it doesn't mean that default setting goes away.
No.
It can still get tripped. We can still fall back into it.
Yeah. Just examples. My wife and I were just talking about this, going through Bible study materials that are supposedly, Christian evangelical Bible study materials that still default to that single line way of thinking. Now that you're saved, here's a list of 6 tips and tricks you've got to do. Here's 10 steps, easy steps to fill the gap between you and God. You've got a lot of work to do, and these are things you have to do, instead of seeing all those things through a gospel lens, right? And pulling you back to Jesus, but it's falling right back in that religiosity. And then the other thing I think, and this is part of the evangelism thing, is even as you're describing the gospel to people, they use that lens to hear everything you're saying. They hear everything you're saying through that lens. If you say, I am not trying to achieve anything on my own, I'm a wretched sinner, wretched, poor, and blind. God gave me his righteousness. I have no righteousness on my own whatsoever. You're describing the gospel in words. The listener, the non-Christian listener, especially today, hears you through the single line lens.
They do.
They're applying that to you, even if you're not describing a single line, you're describing something totally radically different. They'll say things like, oh yeah, I hear what you're saying. You got it all figured out, don't you? You think you're so good and you're at the top of some line. You're trying to get me to, I hear it. You're trying to get me to adopt your religion. And you say, no, I'm not. No, I'm not. It's the gospel. It's radically different than all that. Yeah. I know. They've tuned you out already because they are hearing you through that. So I think that's, and look, this is the thing in a nutshell. Let's go to this part 2 of the podcast. Because I want to hear about your trip. But the thing is, the reason I'm fired up about the book, this little illustration and the way, it's laid out, the way I've laid it out, the contrast between the single line and the double line makes the whole thing really crystal clear in about 5 minutes. You can describe it as something in 5, maybe 2 minutes. It's and you could listen like I did to years and years of great preaching like Tim Keller, and it's all in there, and you could get it. You can just read the Bible and get it. But the illustration does? In a minute, you say, that's it. It just clicks like, that's it. That's the contrast. It lays it out. And then because you have the paradigm in front of you graphically, you can then hear those things and say, now it makes sense. And that's I think, unique contribution of the book. So stay tuned.
Well, they say a picture's worth 1,000 words, right? So,
amen.
I love, in my ministry, I love sharing little illustrations, simple illustrations that illustrate profound truth. The bridge to life, and this is one of those illustrations. I shared a form of it with you.
You did,
because I was listening to Tim Keller, and I was like, there's something different about this. There's something. And a couple of his talks just kind of came together to me, and I started using this and sharing this with people, and it's exciting. It's a very, very important thing, and
full attribution. When you read, I think you saw an early draft, but when readers get maybe someone gets a real book, full attribution, there'll be, and it's either in the foreword or in the first chapter. I'll say, like, my good friend Greg Bryan showed me the basic bones of this illustration, because I listened to Keller for years already at that point, saw the basic from you, illustration of the 2 lines from you, and then kind of built it out from there. And I think then what I'm trying to draw out and can add to that. And by the way, and also full attribution, we've seen it published in a real basic form in a couple other books, and I put all that in the book, just to give credit where credit's due. But the unique contribution is contrasting it with a single line, and then also understanding, well, where does my Christian growth fit in? How my life does change as a Christian. How does that? I am supposed to become a stronger person. I am supposed to be sinning less, right? What does that mean? And how do I, not fall into license and just say, well, fine, I'll do whatever I want, or legalism, right? And say, well, I got to follow a bunch of rules to follow. And in laying it out the way it's laid out helps make that clear instantly, and then draw those contrasts to say, oh, that's how all those elements of the Christian life fit in together.
Yeah, well, one of the implications you brought up just a few minutes ago that I just think is huge, and then we'll wrap this up. This part of it is the fact that when we share the gospel with people, they just, most people, they either put you in the camp of you're religious or you're irreligious, and I think a lot of us. The reason we're not effective in evangelism is we're not good at explaining that we're not religious. We're
That's
not,
right.
and if we could really understand the way people are listening to us and hearing some of the things we're saying, that they're hearing them through that, putting us in those two categories. If we could develop tools that will help people see that, no, we're not religious and we're not irreligious. We believe something totally different that's life-changing. I think that is huge. And I think this illustration that you have does that. It helps people understand that. So I'm excited for you, praying that, you're able to finish this up and find a publisher and get this out there. And in the meantime, we'll just continue to give bits and pieces through the podcast here.
Yeah, little drips and drabs, and help people kind of put it all together. So hopefully out very soon. So we'll see.
All right, well, let's shift the interview. Now you can interview me.
Yeah, so thanks, Greg. I wanted to spend the rest of our time kind of interviewing you about this trip to Israel. And so I think but just so everybody knows, I was really disappointed that my wife and I couldn't go with you this time. Hope we can go again in the next time you go, or sometime in the future. And I think, as I understand, you've been there before years ago, because I remember seeing pictures of you as a younger guy in some of those sites, and then you were
way younger.
And right, you had very different hairstyle, and you were out there, but you had gone before with other people leading the trip, and then this was your chance to lead the trip. Maybe you could spend just a second on that, and before I get to your day-by-day itinerary, I want to ask you about everything, but how did it come about that you actually got a chance to lead this kind of trip?
Well, this was my third trip to Israel. The first one, as you mentioned, happened when I was in my mid-20s, and I had the mullet hairstyle, and I looked very, very different. I was actually went and spent 3 weeks in Israel with my seminary professor, my Hebrew professor, and that was great. I mean, it was like a class, an on-site class. I mean, we had homework and all kinds of preparation, but since we were there for 3 weeks, it was pretty cool, all the places we were able to go. About a year ago, I went with our church, with the founding pastor of our church, and he announced this was going to be his last trip. And I said, I think I would like to come back. So he helped me kind of get me launched to lead my own trip. And so essentially, I led a trip just this past January or February. We started end of the very last day of January, of 14 people to the Holy Land, and it was amazing. I mean, Jim, it's really hard for me to describe how it just makes the Bible come alive when you go to Israel and you get to go to all these places. And even though I'd gone on almost, you could say, the exact same trip I went the year before, I was so excited to go back. And even after experiencing, and now I'm even more excited to go back again.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, it's just there's something about it that is really special. And it was a unique experience this year because, like you said, I was kind of leading some devotionals at the various sites. That's a real privilege to do that, but it's just an amazing experience. So this was like a 10-day trip, essentially 8 days in the country, and we stayed at 3 different hotels. The first hotel we only stay for one night because we're kind of on our way up to Galilee. We fly into Tel Aviv and we want to get up to Galilee, so we go just a little bit, part of the way. And along the way, on day one, we stop at Jaffa, which is that's the name of the city, today. But it actually, in the Bible, it's the town of Joppa. And are you familiar have you heard that name, Joppa, before?
Joppa is the one that's associated with Jonah.
Jonah, yeah. That's the seaport that he goes to when he's like running away from the Lord. So we actually go to that seaport, and it's the coolest thing. I mean, here you're walking around, and I mean, somewhat of a modern, it's not really, it's hard to describe. It's stone buildings, which are very, very old, but yet it's a very modern, city. Cars are driving all around. We were at this ancient seaport called Joppa, which is the place where Jonah boarded a ship to try to run away from the Lord. So at one point I read part of Jonah chapter 1 to the group, and then we just kind of discussed what it's like to think that here we are in the very place that the Bible talks about. And by the way, I should put this in context, because one of the reasons I wanted to go to Israel even like over 30 years ago was because I had an English professor in college who did not like Christians, and she took advantage several times during the semester I had her, just slamming the Bible, just basically making comments that it was made up, that it's fictional, none of it's true. And so that made an impression on me. It didn't shake my faith, but it made me want to go to Israel for that first time. Really? And really? I think even to this day, like, it's one of the reasons I'm excited to go back and to take people. The thing for me now is, like, I'm also sad that you weren't able to go. I want to take my friends there, because it's just it's a hard to explain experience. It just changes the way you read the Bible forever.
Greg, I want to go through some of these cities and towns, like almost play by play with you. We'll take some time to kind of explore that in the spiritual lessons, but just in what you're saying right now, the way that teacher was saying it's all just fairy tales and made up. I think, as a Christian, sometimes you read the Bible and it talks about this place and that place and that place, and as you don't know the place, you kind of skip over it. So they stopped at this place, and when you don't, it's a name that's in maybe a different language, like Hebrew. You don't know, you kind of gloss over it. But I remember, like, in the study that you and I are in, looking at things like, for example, in the book of Acts, by the way, it's so geographical, and so much of the Bible is so anchored in real geography. So if you look at, like, Paul's journeys, he'll say, I went to this place and that place. Then the boat put in at this place. We stopped at the harbor, that place. And they're all real places.
Yes.
It's not just like, and I think I think of it sometimes, maybe I'm still guilty of this, Greg. I still read it like a kid's fairy tale book. Like it's, Jesus born in a manger in Bethlehem in a far, far place in a galaxy far, far away. Like, you read it as it's not a real town in a real place.
And then you also think that those places don't exist anymore, or you can't, they've been long destroyed, and some of them have. But Joppa, I mean, that is, Jonah is like thousands of years old. Several thousand years when that happened with Jonah. But that same place, that same city, Joppa, is mentioned in Acts chapter 10. And I just want to read, it says, at Caesarea, there was a man named Cornelius, a centurion in what was known as the Italian regiment. He and all his family were devout and God-fearing. He gave generously to those in need and prayed to God regularly. One day, about 3 p.m, he had a vision, and he distinctly saw an angel of God who came to him and said, Cornelius. Cornelius stared at him in fear. "What is it, Lord?" he asked. The angel answered, "Your prayers and your gifts to the poor have come up as a memorial offering before God. Now send men to Joppa." Okay, so
The
send men
Joppa.
to Joppa to bring back a man named Simon, who is called Peter. He is staying with Simon the tanner, whose house is by the sea. Now here's the coolest thing. They actually think that they know we might, and some of these sites are, authentic sites, which means we know that this is where it took place, and some are, maybe less certain. And this may
Yeah.
be one of the less certain ones, but there's a place in Joppa that our guide took us to, and it's right by the sea, just like the Bible describes it. It might be Simon the tanner's house. And this is the same house that Peter was staying at, who this angel told Cornelius in the town of Caesarea to send for him. We're literally standing outside the door of this house.
Yeah.
And because it's for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years has been identified as Simon the tanner's house, it actually says Simon the tanner on top of it.
Okay.
But even if it's not his house, if that's not the exact house, what you come to realize is, think about how close you are to where his real house was anyway.
That's right. Maybe it's the house next door.
It could be you're in the neighborhood.
Right.
And when
Simon Peter walked.
Right. And just like you were just saying, you read through these, when you read the Bible, you skip over a lot of these names and stuff because they don't mean anything to you. But
Right.
if you go to Joppa and you go to Simon the tanner's house, you'll never read Acts chapter 10 the same way. Because and plus you can picture it. You can actually picture how his house was right on the sea, because you can see the sea behind it and hear the waves. And you can think about him being a tanner, so he worked with unclean animals. And then you start picturing, like, okay, so Peter he was staying with a guy that was dealing with unclean animals. So the gospel was already working in his life, because some of the biases he grew up with, he was setting aside because of the impact Jesus had on him.
Wow, never thought of that. Never thought of that before. But I want to ask you, standing there, like outside the house or in the doorway or whatever, that must make that passage come alive to you in a way you've never thought of before, right? I mean, it's got to feel so real to you.
It does. I mean, it just makes you so excited. Like, I can't wait to go back there, and I hope I get the opportunity to go there with you and say, look, where it's, I mean, I can remember this year when I read that passage, like, inside my heart, I was jumping up and down. I don't think I was literally jumping up and down, but I was like, we're in Joppa. We're in Joppa. We're, soak it in. Like, you're actually in Joppa right now, real close to where this took place. So you can start envisioning, and this is what I love about the Bible, is there's so much, it's so historically accurate. It's unbelievable. Yeah. So I'm going to jump ahead and tell you that
before you do, I just, because we were talking about the book before, and it's talking about people that made the shift and didn't make the shift, and writing about or seeing the Bible in a whole new light, because that's the illustration. I just was polishing off a chapter on Jonah, and write about how he actually never did make the shift to see, because I don't want to go back into detail about now in great detail, but I just was meditating, writing about the book of Jonah not too long ago, this week, and I can imagine having, if you're there at Joppa, how much more that would just come alive to you, because it feels so real when your feet have actually walked or their feet walked.
Yeah, you can actually, like, think about Jonah coming to this city and how he's running away from God, and you could see the ships. You can picture ships, and you can see evidence that this was a major port.
Yeah,
ancient port, like an ancient port, not a new port. Right. And you could just picture the ships being there and him jumping on the ship and all that happening. It's just unbelievable. But then here's another thing. The next day, so we're heading up and we're going through Caesarea, and there's another interesting passage that really comes to life. And it's again in the book of Acts. It's in Acts chapter 12. And we go to these ancient ruins from Herod's time. And we go to this place that this kind of amphitheater that Herod built. And it's exactly the place where in Acts chapter 12, in verses 20 to 24, and I'll just read it real quick. It talks about, I'll just start in verse 21. On the appointed day, Herod, wearing his royal robes, sat on his throne and delivered a public address to the people. They shouted, "This is the voice of a God, not a man." Immediately, because Herod did not give praise to God, an angel of the Lord struck him down, and he was eaten by worms and died. Now, I mean, that's a kind of obscure passage, but
I remember it.
The cool thing about it is we actually know where that took place, and we actually go to the auditorium, and we know the spot where Herod probably was when all this, and you can just picture, hundreds of people around him shouting this, that he's, a god. And you get to see this. His architecture is just amazing. I mean, he was extravagant buildings, and we see the ruins of those buildings, but this amphitheater is intact. I mean, you actually walk and you can sit in it, and you can see the spot, the very spot where this event took place.
Wow. Hey, Greg, were a lot of the ruins like intact like that? You're describing an amphitheater where you actually sit in the seats, or were some of them just some, hard to understand, hard to say, some rocks? You say, yeah, that's supposed to be the house of somebody you can't really picture. Were a lot of them really like in pretty good shape, or pretty, fully formed like an amphitheater that you could very
well? I think one of the cool things about this experience, and specifically this trip that we take people on, is that it's varied. Like you can see sort of what you're talking about, where they're just now like uncovering stuff,
like
and they're trying to figure out
recent dig.
Yeah, like Magdala, for example, the town of Mary. Actually, Mary Magdala, her last name is not necessarily Magdala. She's Mary of Magdala. She was from the town of Magdala. Yeah, she was from the town of Magdala. There's a whole town that they discovered because they were building a hotel, and then they found a synagogue there, and it's probably a synagogue that Jesus taught in. When we go to that site, I read the passage in Luke chapter 8, where it talked about how these women were following Jesus and supporting him with out of their own means. And there's some wealthy women listed there, but Mary of Magdala is mentioned. Mary Magdalene is mentioned as one of those women who he cast out 7 demons.
Right.
And so again, that is like, they just recently discovered that. It is just amazing. And you can just, that Jesus was there in that town. Another interesting place that we went to, and I'm going to jump, I mean, there's so many.
Well, don't skip Nazareth. Did you go to Nazareth?
We did go to Nazareth.
Did you go to Nazareth? Is supposed to be the precipice where they're going to throw Jesus off, and he goes back to preach there to his hometown. And at first they like him a lot. Then they get really angry with him because he starts talking about their sin. They're going to throw him off a cliff.
Yes.
Did you see that part? Did you?
Yeah, we saw that from a distance, but the cool thing about Nazareth is just that you get a feel for what a small town Nazareth was, and how, if you remember the conversation in John chapter 1 between Philip and Nathanael, it says the next day Jesus decided to leave for Galilee. Finding Philip, he said, "Follow me." Philip, like Andrew and Peter, was from the town of Bethsaida. Philip found Nathanael and told him, "Hey, we found the one Moses wrote about in the law, and about whom the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." And then you remember what Nathanael says, "Nazareth."
That's right. Right.
"And anything good come from there?" Nathanael asks. "Come and see." Well, part of the reason he said that is because Nazareth was such a small town, and it still is kind of a small town. And so you really get a feel for like, yeah, I mean, it was just, he was from this, like, he grew up in this kind of tiny town, and that nobody, but then listen to this. It says, when Jesus saw Nathanael approaching, he said to him, "Here is truly an Israelite in whom there is no deceit." "Well, how do you know me?" Nathanael asked. Jesus said, "I saw you while you were sitting under the fig tree before Philip called you." Have you ever wondered what that meant when he said,
Yeah,
"I saw
sure.
you under the fig tree"? What was happening when he said, I mean, what was he doing under the fig tree?
Right. And there's lots of
Well,
interpretations of that or speculation.
first of all, fig trees, you see them all over Israel. And
Yeah.
so, again, the language of the Bible, like we read it, I don't have any fig trees in my yard. Do you have any in your yard?
No.
Probably not. But you can see these fig trees are just around. But the phrase "I saw you under a fig tree," it turns out, is like an idiom that meant, it's an idiom of a person who is studying the messianic passages about the Messiah.
Really?
Yeah. So that's why he has such a dramatic. So one of the guys who went on the trip with me is a doctor from Youngstown, and when I read this passage, he brought that up, and the tour guide, she had never heard that, but then we did some research, and it turns out that it was kind of a common idiom of a person that was studying specifically the passages in the Jewish Bible about the Messiah.
Interesting. A little bit like the Ethiopian eunuch was doing when he was going in the book of Acts, another
Right,
passage.
right.
Right. Trying desperately to find the Messiah, understand the Messiah. I'm sure it was common, people searching like crazy to find out, understand the Messiah, when he was coming and
That's
signs of
what,
it coming.
right. So that's why in the next verse, Nathanael says, he declares, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel."
Yeah.
That's why
Right.
he went from saying, "Nazareth, how can anything good come from there?"
Yeah.
to saying, "You are the Son of God."
Right.
You know, so why was the response so dramatic? It was because when Jesus said that to him, I always thought that like he was sitting under the fig tree, and like, I don't know what he was doing under the fig tree, but it was like Jesus said, I see, I saw you, I saw what you did there, I saw what you.
Yeah. Like you were doing something wrong there, and I saw
Right.
everything you did. Right. Like I
But it
caught you in the
turns
trap.
out, he was, he basically, Jesus is saying, "I know you've been studying the scriptures about the Messiah,
Yeah.
and I see you doing that, and
Wow.
that's why I'm calling you to follow me." You
Wow.
know. So, and then, Jesus says, "You believe because I said I saw you under the fig tree. You will see greater things than that. Very truly, you will see heaven open and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man."
That's right.
Which recently I brought that up when I was talking about Jacob, and how Jacob saw a stairway that started from heaven and came to earth. The idea that we can't build a ladder up to God, but God has to come down to us. But here Jesus expounds on that and says, "I am the ladder.
That's right.
I am the
The
way
bridge,
to
right?
God."
The connection, the bridge between heaven and earth, right? Yeah, he's the only way.
Yeah. So
Well,
that was
one more.
Nazareth.
Okay, that's great. That's great.
Um,
I'm glad to hear your thoughts on Nazareth. I do remember we were studying it together, looking at how people in Judea, like, let me see if I get this right, or around Jerusalem, they look down their nose at people in Galilee, like a little bit farther north. But the Galileans themselves needed someone to look for them to look down their nose at, and that was Nazareth. So you think about any community or people that you look down your nose at, within that community or people, they also need someone to look down their nose at, some backwater place that they think is lower than them.
yeah, and by
And
the
that was
way, when he's referred to as Jesus of Nazareth, the other thing to remember is that was actually, they were actually intentionally trying to discount him, because he
yeah,
wasn't
wow.
Jesus from Nazareth. He was Jesus from Bethlehem.
Right. He was
He
born in
was
Bethlehem,
Jesus from Bethlehem. Why didn't they call him Jesus from Bethlehem?
suburban
Because that would
Jerusalem.
put him in line. That would connect him to those messianic passages that the
Right.
Savior is going to come out of Bethlehem. So they
Right.
intentionally called him Jesus of Nazareth, as a way to be like, this guy's not, he's nothing special. He's from Nazareth.
Well, and one of them says, search the scriptures, no prophet comes out of Galilee, right? I mean, they're
Right.
it's part of the biblical narrative that puts the look down their nose at the Galileans.
Right.
But he was right. He wasn't from Nazareth. He was from Bethlehem, suburban Jerusalem, right? So
Yeah.
higher status than Nazareth, but fulfilling the biblical prophecies, even more importantly, that the Messiah is going to come from Bethlehem.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So that's all really great stuff, Greg. We're just on what, day 2 or 3, I think.
I know. So
How about the Sea of Galilee? What was that like? I mean, I've seen
that's one
pictures.
of
It
my
seems a bigger sea than. Oh yeah, it
that's
seems
one of
bigger
my
than I
favorite
thought it would be.
that's one of my favorite places. I mean, like, I'm excited
So,
to it's just, I don't know, it's such a special place because of all that took place there. So much of Jesus's ministry happened around Galilee, around the Sea of Galilee. And so one of the coolest things that I'm even looking forward to next year, Lord willing, if planning on going back next year, is going out on a boat on the Sea of Galilee with a group. And then the Sea of Galilee is probably 8 miles wide and 13 miles long. So it's actually a lake. It's a freshwater lake. Some of the scriptures call it the Lake of Gennesaret.
okay.
But it's also, I should mention that the day before we went out on the lake had a storm. Like, it was crazy wind and rain, like horizontal rain happening the day before we went out on the lake. And so I actually talked to some guy in the hotel, same hotel we were staying at, who went out on the lake in the storm.
In a boat?
And he said it was nuts. He said the waves were the boat was just, constantly going up and down, and we were kind of laughing about it because he was like, it was not, I was scared. And I was like,
he just wanted to experience a storm on the Sea of Galilee
well, they just took the group out. Like, I mean, I don't know. I'm sure there's some conditions where they would actually say it's not safe to take the group out, but they took the group out.
It was his scheduled tour.
It was a scheduled tour. Like, that could have been us. That could have been us.
Right.
But we were the next day, and fortunately for us, it was like very calm, and so again, you read these stories of how Jesus stilled the storm, and how the waves, they think they're going to drown, and it's hard to picture it until you're there, and you can see that one day, the day before we were on the Sea of Galilee, there were storms and crazy waves. The next day it was like calm as glass. Wow. And but one of my favorite things to do on that is to read the passage where Jesus is walking on the water, and then Peter's in the boat, and Peter says, "Hey, if it's you, tell me to come out on the water." And so Peter starts walking on the water, and so I shared like 7 lessons from Peter walking on the water.
Really?
Yeah. You want to hear what they are?
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
I'll just briefly mention them. And we didn't read the passage, but I think most people understand. If you want to read the passage, it's in Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 to 33. So the 7 lessons, the first one is that we need to look for Jesus and keep looking to Jesus.
Yeah.
We need to look for Jesus, but then keep looking to Jesus. The idea that when Peter took his eyes off of Jesus, he started to sink.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it kind of goes along with being gospel addicts. We need to keep looking at Jesus.
Amen.
We need to keep, we don't just look at him, find him, and then stop looking at him. Right. So second one is, when Jesus commands you, you obey him. So, Jesus commanded him and told him to come out, to get out of the boat. And Peter did that. The third lesson is, faith is simply taking the next step. What we don't focus on is that Peter did walk on the water.
Yeah, amazing.
He actually did walk on the water. I mean,
Exactly.
he made a couple good steps, right?
Right.
And then he took his eyes off Jesus and he started to sink. And that's the fourth lesson, is that fear will sink you.
Mm,
Fear will sink you. And the reason he got fearful is because he took his eyes off Jesus.
yeah.
And then the fifth lesson, and these all kind of overlap, is that Jesus saves you from many things.
Hmm.
And I think that if you and I reflect on our Christian life, we will say that Jesus saved us from many things. And so in that story, let's assume that at this point Peter is a follower of Jesus, and he has salvation. Jesus reached down when he was sinking. Jesus saved him again.
Yeah.
He saved him physically, from drowning, but he also saves him spiritually.
Right.
So I think that the lesson there is that how we need to take time to reflect on all the different ways Jesus has saved us. I mean, you could say, maybe you almost got married to another girl, and that
God
girl would have
forbid.
just ruined your life,
Absolutely. Right.
and
Right.
so you could be like, Jesus saved me from that,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know?
Actually, it's funny because Tim Keller talks about that sometimes as that exact circumstance. But
Yeah.
you get
And
all
that,
kinds of ways. You're right, Greg. All kinds of ways that Jesus is saving you. Even though you're saved, you're eternally, but he's saving you from all kinds of things. And praise the Lord, he saves all of us from really bad, horrific decisions we might otherwise make. So
right. And so then the sixth lesson is that a little faith is better than no faith.
hmm,
We struggle with, like, well, I don't have enough faith to do that. Well,
yeah,
you don't have to have a lot of faith. You just have to have a little faith. And
yeah.
then the final lesson is that you can choose to worry or worship. And at the end of that passage, Peter worships him. You can worry about the waves and all your surroundings, all the things happening around you, or you can just worship God. So anyway, sharing, a devotional like that on the Sea of Galilee is an incredible experience. I mean, it's just hard to describe, It's just, we're out there all by ourselves. It just makes the Bible come alive. So that's one of my highlights.
Yeah, that's got to be incredible, both for you as a leader of the kind of study and for people like listening and meditating on those passages and thinking about it being right there where all these things actually happen.
Yes. Yeah. So there's so much. I mean, we visited so many different places. Another highlight for me was going to the Jordan River and baptizing people in the
Yeah,
Jordan
tell me about
River.
that. You started telling me about that, but how did that come about? What happened there?
We asked my group if anybody wants to be baptized, like maybe a renewal of your baptism vows. And it turned out that 4 people from my group wanted to be baptized, and 2 of them had never been baptized before.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, a couple from our church actually had
Wow.
never been baptized before. So it was a great honor. Again, if you're going to get baptized for the first time, what an amazing place to get baptized,
Oh,
but
yeah.
in the Jordan River,
Yeah.
so they have a place that pilgrims go, and they have it all set up for us, for these baptism. We did like a little worship service beforehand. We sang Amazing Grace. I read the passage where Jesus was baptized by John. And if you remember, like, John's like, kind of like, I don't want, why, you should baptize me. I shouldn't baptize you. But then
Yeah.
Jesus says, no, you need to do it to fulfill all righteousness. And so I shared a devotional about that, like, four reasons why Jesus was baptized by John. And so I talked about how, it was an affirmation of John's ministry for Jesus to be baptized by him. It also signaled the start of Jesus's own ministry.
That's right.
But then the biggest reason is that to identify with sinners. And so I really kind of emphasize that point, that baptism is a picture of our salvation, dying, death, and resurrection.
Yeah.
So anyway, at the end of that experience, and that was a great experience. Climbing out, I was walking up the steps to go change because I'm like soaking wet, obviously. And this couple comes up to me and they're like strangers, and they say, "Hey, do you know a pastor?" And I was like, "Well, I'm a pastor." And they're like, "Well, would you baptize us?" I look around, I'm like, "Sure, why not?" And so of course I wanted to hear their story, and I wanted to hear their faith story and make sure that they were true believers, and
Right.
they were solid. The husband was originally from India. They are a married couple from Arizona. So long story short, I I got to baptize two strangers. It
That's so
was
cool.
the tour guide that took us, that she by the way is the secret sauce of this whole trip, because she's been leading tours for like 40 years and she lives in Israel. And so she's just like a constant, almost like a running encyclopedia. So all throughout the day, she's sharing different things, about where we're at, details. She's answering questions. She just makes the trip like totally, worth it. In fact, I continue to learn from her the more I'm around her.
Wow.
So of just like the historical background and different things. But that really struck her because she's like, Greg, I've been leading lots of tours. In fact, she was a tour guide for Tim LaHaye. If you like, years and years ago, she used to be his special tour guide.
Oh, wow.
And she said that most often she was impressed that I was baptized those two people. And I was like, why wouldn't I do that? But I can understand people that lead bigger groups. They there's logistical reasons why they wouldn't have time to do it, or
Yeah.
then we also go to, and there's so many places we go. There's no way we're going to mention them all, but we go to the place called Engedi, which is really cool. It's like a waterfall, and it's really close to where David. Remember when in 1 Samuel 24, where David flees from Saul,
Yeah.
and then he has a chance to kill Saul because
Yeah. In a cave, right?
Saul went into a cave to use the bathroom, and David crawls up and cuts his robe, and
Because
then he
David
feels
was already hiding in that very cave, right?
and David was in that cave, and then David feels guilty that he even cut his robe, and but anyway, so we go to that place in Getty, and I was able to read the story, and we were able to just like share kind of our different thoughts. And again, you can see the caves, you can see the you can imagine what it was like, for David and Saul both to be there, and for that experience. But and of course we went to Masada, we went to Qumran and saw the caves where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, and swam in the Dead Sea, which is one of my favorite things to do too, because it's the
What's that
lowest.
like?
Oh man, it's hard to describe. It's 10 times saltier than the ocean, so it's almost, you can float on your stomach basically. It's just the weirdest experience. It's supposed to be really healthy for your skin and stuff.
Uh,
I love it every time. I'm almost like running down to the beach to get in there and make the most. I was getting nervous that day actually, because our time was getting shorter and shorter. And I was like, oh man, if we don't, I'm going to be so disappointed if we don't get that chance to go down there. And I hope you get to experience it, but it's the lowest place on earth, the lowest place on earth. And it's the saltiest body of water on earth. And I want to be sensitive to our time here, Jim.
I
We're
want to hear one more thing. I want to hear about the Mount of Olives.
the Mount of Olives.
Yeah, I think in the whole trip, I was
Yeah.
just when your first time about the going up there and the itinerary. That's just one thing I was really looking forward to. We were in kind of
The Mount of Olives,
Minnesota.
like the day after we get into Jerusalem on like in the evening. We drive into Jerusalem and we stop at Mount Scopus, which is a popular place where you can oversee the whole city. And we read one of the Psalms of Ascent there, and say a prayer for, Jerusalem, pray for the peace of Jerusalem. But then the next morning, we go to the Mount of Olives. And the Mount of Olives is a really cool place. Obviously, Jesus did a lot of teaching there, but for me, it's the Garden of Gethsemane that is the most.
Oh, wow. You went to the Garden of Gethsemane too?
Yeah. I mean, there's two Garden of Gethsemanes. There's a public one that is open to everybody, and then there's a private garden that you can rent out. And as part of our tour, we rent that private garden for an hour. And so we had the whole garden to ourselves. And I read the passage about, the prayers
Yeah. Stay
when
with me 1
Jesus was
hour.
in the Garden of Gethsemane, and the disciples couldn't stay awake.
Right.
And then I kind of just sent us all out, encourage people to just, spend time in prayer and meditation. And you can walk around this garden, there's places you can sit, but and some of the trees in the olive trees in the Garden of Gethsemane, they say might be 2,000 years old.
Oh my goodness.
Like they're definitely very close to 2,000 years old. So they could be the original trees
Wow.
that were there during the time of Christ.
Wow.
But just being there, and we start at the top of the Mount of Olives and we make our descent down, kind of the way Jesus did when he mourns over Jerusalem. I don't know if you remember that passage.
I do. He does that from the Mount of Olives?
That's the triumphal entry. He does that from the Mount of Olives. So we kind of walk that path, and it takes us down to the Garden of Gethsemane. And I mean, that's just definitely one of the highlights. And then the whole trip kind of caps off with going to the Garden Tomb, which could be the actual tomb that Jesus was buried in. And it's real close to Golgotha, where Jesus was crucified. And there's two potential locations where that happened, and we get to see both of them. One of them, the church is built over it, called the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Another one is literally a bus stop, which I think is the more likely location, and it's real close to this Garden Tomb. But in the Garden Tomb, we had our own like little room, almost like the upper room, and we were able to read the passages about the resurrection and talk about the importance of the resurrection, and sing songs, and we just had this great sharing time.
Wait, inside the tomb?
We actually do get to go in. You do get to go in the tomb.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, inside the tomb, it's very small. So only a few people can get in there at one time, but you can see, and whether or not it's the exact tomb, nobody knows, but it's certainly, it makes a lot of sense that it could be, because of how close it is to where Jesus was crucified, and that the way the tomb is set up and the way it's described in the Bible, it very well could be the actual tomb. But if it's not, you get an idea of exactly what it was like, how Jesus would have been laying there, and how you can go in and see, and how, the different accounts, again, they just kind of come alive because you get to experience it. Yeah, Jim, I mean, I want to go back. I'm actually planning. I'm in the final planning stages of nailing down the next year's trip. I think it's going to be January 8th through the 17th in 2024.
Okay. We'll keep our listeners posted, I guess, as your time's kind of firm up and people can think about that. But well, it's just so cool, Greg. And I think we can kind of maybe wrap up with that. But just as you're describing these things, I'm thinking how it connects the geography, the things you've read about in the Bible, and with actually being there. Just the last story you're telling about how the tomb and what it's like, and how people would have poked their head. I'm thinking about the women who went there, saw Jesus was not there, and Mary meets Jesus in the garden. Then they run and tell the disciples. All those things are physical things that happen in real space and time. And you can't, if you're there and you see it, you say, oh, this is what it would have been like to stand here and then run to where the disciples are. And put that together in a real way that you can't unless you kind of go there and see it for yourself. So thanks for sharing all these details, Greg. It's just fantastic.
Oh, you're welcome. And I would encourage all of our listeners, if they get the opportunity to visit the Holy Land, to do it. I believe it will only strengthen your faith in Jesus.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Gospel Addict Podcast. Feel free to contact us via email at gospeladdictpodcast@gmail.com.
Stay tuned for our next episode, and remember, on your worst days, you're never beyond the reach of God's grace, and on your best days, you're never beyond the need of God's grace.
See you next time.